guys know that one of the most difficult challenges for any wide receiver to achieve in a single season is eclipsing 1,700 yards? Now, it might seem like a pretty random number, but it's only been accomplished 13 total times by 12 different players. That means that even some of the best players of all time couldn't pull this off because so many different things have to go right. Today we're breaking down all 12 of these players to do so, and I want to see how many people remember these individual seasons. Up first, we have a player that many people watching this video likely haven't even heard of. Charlie Hennigan was somebody who was decades ahead of his time at the wide receiver position. He possessed blazing speed, able to burn almost anybody in the secondary that he was up against. He even went to LSU initially on a track scholarship, but they wouldn't allow him to play football, so he transferred to Northwestern State, where he could do both track and football. In the 1961 season with the Houston Oilers, he became the first player in history to reach the 1,700-yard mark. Hennigan started off this elite season on the right foot when the Oilers took on the Raiders. This was an absolute blowout in Houston's favor, with them coming out on top by a final score of 55-0. While he was only able to pull in 4 passes, Hennigan made the most of them, finishing the day with 113 yards and 1 touchdown. Hennigan finished the regular season with 3 games over 200 receiving yards and 10 games over 100 yards through the air. Even though he finished the regular season with 82 receptions, Hennigan still accumulated 1,746 yards and 12 touchdowns, averaging 21.3 yards per catch, leading the league in both receiving yards and receiving yards per game with 124.7. Houston dominated the league through the air, and Hennigan and his quarterback George Blanda established themselves as the top quarterback wide receiver duo that the league had to offer. Hennigan was named to the Pro Bowl, All-Pro First Team, and came in 3rd in the AFL AP Player of the Year voting behind Oilers running back Billy Cannon and his quarterback George Blanda. You can see the Oilers were very dominant that year. To make this season even more impressive for Hennigan, he achieved all of this in only a 14-game regular season. Today, even in a more passing-dominated game, we still see even the league's top receivers struggle to hit that 1,700-yard mark, even in a 17-game regular season. Let's not kid ourselves, though. Players of every sport have come a long way from the 1960s, and there are many more freak athletes nowadays. It took over 3 decades until another wide receiver was able to join Hennigan in the 1,700-yard club. That player was Isaac Bruce in the 1995 season. While this was still a couple of years before he was an essential piece of the St. Louis Rams' greatest show on turf team, Bruce was quickly establishing himself as one of the best wide receivers that the league had to offer in only his 2nd season. However, this eventual historic season still didn't get off to the hottest start. In the first 2 games of the year, when the Rams took on the Packers and the Saints, Bruce only combined for 7 catches for 105 yards and 2 touchdowns. While that might not seem too bad for a normal receiver, you're going to need a lot more yards, obviously, to reach that 1,700-yard mark. Thankfully, these 2 games were a couple of his worst from the season, and he quickly got things back on track. His most impressive performance of that season came in the final week when the Rams took on the Dolphins. Bruce finished the contest with an insane 15 catches for 210 yards and a touchdown. Despite this elite performance from the team's top pass catcher, St. Louis was still dominated by a final score of 41-22. While the Rams struggled to a 7-9 record this season, Bruce still carved out a spot for himself in the discussion for the league's best receiver. Over the course of the regular season, he had 1 game over 200 receiving yards and 9 games over 100. While the Rams missed the playoffs, Bruce still accumulated a very impressive 119 receptions for 1,781 yards and 13 touchdowns. Shockingly, he didn't lead the league in any of those categories, in large part due to our next receiver up that we're going to talk about. Isaac Bruce's breakout year in 1995 would have easily earned him the spot as the league's top wide receiver, leading the league in receiving yards and earning All-Pro or at least Pro Bowl honors. However, one man stood in his way. Who else would it be besides Jerry Rice? Rice is widely regarded as the best wide receiver that the game has ever seen, not only remaining a starting caliber player for the entirety of his 20 years in the league, but also having one of the greatest peaks that a player at the position has ever had. Arguably, his best season came in 1995. Despite being 33 years old at the time, Rice was still playing at a level that no one had ever seen before. His season got off to a nice start in week number 1 against against the Saints, having 6 catches for 87 yards and a touchdown. While this was a solid performance, no doubt, it did not hold up compared to what he had in store for the rest of the year. His best game from the 1995 season came in Week 16 when the Niners took on the Vikings. Rice could not be stopped in this matchup, torching the Vikings for 289 yards and 3 touchdowns on 14 receptions. Rice's hat trick led the Niners to a tight 37-30 victory. When the regular season was all said and done, Rice had gone for 200 or more receiving yards in just one game, and over 100 in 9 of those games that he played in. He finished the year with 122 receptions for 1,848 yards and 15 touchdowns, averaging 115.5 yards per game, leading the league in both receiving yards and receiving yards per game. This earned himself a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, and he came in second place in MVP voting, finishing just behind Brett Favre. There's even a chance that Rice could have got to 1,900 yards had Steve Young not been forced to miss 5 games due to an injury that year. After Rice, it took 7 more years before another league's top wide receiver was able to eclipse the 1,700-yard mark, that player being Marvin Harrison in 2002. While many have compared Ohio State phenom and 4th overall pick to the Arizona Cardinals' Marvin Harrison Jr. to his father, he's going to have some enormous shoes to fill. In his prime, Harrison and quarterback Peyton Manning were one of the most feared duos that the league had to offer, and 2 of them torched opposing defenses almost every game of that 2002 season. Similar to many of the wide receivers who have achieved 1,700 yards in a season before him, Harrison's first game was relatively a quiet one. In a tough matchup against the Jaguars, he was held in check for only 4 catches for 34 yards and a touchdown. The only other time that he finished with less receiving yards that year was his second matchup against Jacksonville in the final week of the regular season, when he finished with 28. While the Jaguars had his number this year, almost nobody else could do anything to stop Harrison. His best game came in week number 15 against the Cleveland Browns. Harrison finished that matchup with an elite 172 yards and 2 touchdowns on 9 receptions. These 2 touchdowns wound up being essential for the Colts' winning effort, with them coming out on top by a final score of 28-23. While Harrison didn't have any games in which he surpassed the 200-yard mark, he did eclipse 100 yards 10 different times that year. He's also by far the best receiver in the league this season, racking up 143 catches for 1,722 yards and 11 touchdowns, with an average of 107.6 yards per game, leading the league in receptions, receiving yards, and yards per game. This earned himself a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, and he came in second place in Offensive Player of the Year voting, behind only Pheoms. It took another decade before a 5th wide receiver joined that 1,700-yard club, that player being Calvin Johnson. Despite cutting his career short and choosing to retire after only 9 years in the league, Johnson is arguably the most talented player to ever take the field at the position. He stood in at a massive 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed in at 237 pounds. Johnson had the greatest statistical season yardage-wise from a wide receiver in league history in 2012. His campaign got off to a hot start in the Lions' Week 1 matchup against the Rams. Despite only being targeted 7 times in that game, Megatron still pulled in 6 passes for 111 yards. Detroit picked up one of their few wins this season, coming out on top by a final score of 27-23. While he finished with more receiving yards in a separate occasion, I think his strongest performance from that 2012 season came in the Lions' Week 10 matchup against the Vikings, just simply because of his efficiency. Once again, Johnson caught almost everything that was thrown his way, pulling in 12 of his 13 targets for 207 yards and a touchdown. Despite his elite showing, Detroit still came up a bit short by a final score of 34-24. He ended that 2012 regular season with 2 games over 200 receiving yards and 11 games over 100. Despite the historic season from Johnson, the Lions still had an awful year, ending with a 4-12 record. While he struggled to find the end zone, scoring only 5 receiving touchdowns the entire year, Johnson still led the league with 122 receptions, 1,964 receiving yards, and averaging 122.8 receiving yards per game. He still currently holds the NFL record for most receiving yards in a single season. These insane stats earned him a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, and he finished tied for 3rd in Offensive Player of the Year voting, behind Adrian Peterson and Peyton Manning. This time around, it only took 3 more seasons before another pair of wide receivers eclipsed the 1,700-yard mark, mark, the first of which being Antonio Brown. Despite the ungraceful tail end of his NFL career, during his peak with the Pittsburgh Steelers, Brown was one of the most talented wide receivers in all of football. One of his many great seasons came in 2015. He started off the season hot with a 9-catch, 133-yard, and 1 touchdown performance against the Patriots. Even with this incredible showing from AB, the Steelers still came up short by a final score of 28-21. However, even a great game like this was nothing in comparison to what he did in week number 9 against the Raiders. While Brown failed to find the end zone in this one, he still had a huge impact on the game, pulling in a ridiculous 17 passes for 284 yards on 23 targets. Even with this crazy production from their wide receiver 1, the Steelers still narrowly escaped with a 38-35 win. AB finished that year with 1 game over 200 yards and 9 games over 100. Over the 16 games that he played in during the regular season, he pulled in a league-leading 136 receptions, along with 1,834 yards and 10 touchdowns. This earned himself a spot in the Pro Bowl and the All-Pro First Team, and he finished in 2nd place in Offensive Player of the Year voting, behind only Cam Newton. While AB had a crazy year in 2015, it could be argued that Julio Jones was actually the best wide receiver that year. He and Matt Ryan were one of the best quarterback wide receiver duos at the time, leading the Falcons to a Super Bowl appearance just 1 year following Jones's historic season. He got his 2015 season started off on the right foot, pulling in 9 passes for 141 yards and 2 touchdowns. Atlanta needed every single yard that they got out of their franchise wide receiver in this contest as well, barely coming out on top by a final score of 26-24 against the Eagles. While this was a crazy game from one of the NFL's top wideouts, his best day of the 2015 season came in week 16 when the Falcons took on the Panthers. In this matchup, Jones went off for 178 yards and a touchdown on only 9 catches. Once again, the Falcons came out on top, this time winning by a final score of 20-13. By the time the regular season was all said and done with, while Jones did not go for over 200 yards in any particular game, did have 9 games in which he surpassed 100. Over the course of the regular season, Jones accumulated 136 catches for 1,871 yards and 8 touchdowns with an average of 116.9 receiving yards per game, leading the league in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving yards per game. This earned himself a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, and he was disrespected, coming in 6th place in the Offensive Player of the Year award voting. While AB finished 4 spots in front of Jones in that Offensive Player of the Year voting, it could easily be argued that Julio had the stronger season. Now, less than a decade after Antonio Brown and Julio Jones's elite seasons in 2015, Michael Thomas would join the 1,700-yard club. Interestingly, despite this season happening 5 years ago already, it was the last in which Thomas was able to suit up in over 10 games over the course of a season. The duo of Thomas and quarterback Drew Brees lit up the league this season. He started off on a great note when the Saints took on the Texans in week number 1. Thomas finished the matchup with an incredible 10 catches for 123 yards. While he didn't find the end zone in that one, the Saints still came out on top in a tight 30-28 game. This was one of Thomas's best games in the entire season. However, his strongest performance came in week 5 when the Saints took on the Bucs. Thomas completely stole the show in this one, finishing with 11 catches for 182 yards and 2 touchdowns. While he didn't post any games over 200 yards, he did have 10 over 100. No other wide receiver could stack up with Thomas this season, with him posting 149 receptions for 1,725 yards and 9 touchdowns, averaging 107.8 receiving yards per game. Not only did he lead the NFL in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving yards per game, he also set and still holds the NFL record for single-season receptions. This earned himself a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, and he also brought home the Offensive Player of the Year award. Since this channel was heavily focused on fantasy football, by the way, before I started making these documentary-type videos, I wanted to ask you guys, am I the only one that constantly fell into that trap of drafting Michael Thomas since 2020, hoping that he would have that comeback season and return to his old self? He was going so late in those fantasy drafts that I just couldn't help myself. I had to do it, and now it appears that that ship has sailed for the last time. I'm really going to miss the pre-injury slant god Michael Thomas from 2016 to 2019. 2015. Just 2 years later, Cooper Kupp joined the 1,700-yard club. In this season, Kupp and quarterback Matthew Stafford were unstoppable, with a connection unlike anything that we have seen in quite some time. He started off the season strong when the Rams took on the Bears. Kupp pulled in 7 passes for 108 yards and a touchdown. This was a very easy win for the Rams, coming out on top by a final score of 34-14. While this was a very impressive performance, Kupp's best game came the following week against the Colts. He torched them for 163 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 9 catches. Los Angeles needed every yard that they got out of him in this one, narrowly escaping by 3 points, 27-24. The Rams proved to be a team of destiny this year, with the duo of Stafford and Kupp carrying that offense, paired with their elite veteran stacked defense. They wound up taking down the Bengals in the Super Bowl by a final score of 23-20, and Kupp came up with a clutch touchdown to win the game, one of 2 that he scored in that game. Along with his 2 TDs, Kupp also pulled in 8 passes for 92 yards. It was really crazy to watch, because even if the defense is game planned mainly around stopping Cooper Kupp that season, it could not be done. He was going crazy. He finished the season with 145 receptions, 1,947 receiving yards, and 16 receiving touchdowns, averaging 114.5 receiving yards per game. To put just how dominant of a season for Kupp this was into perspective, he earned the receiving triple crown, leading the league in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. This earned himself a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, won the Offensive Player of the Year award, and came in 3rd place in MVP voting behind only Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers. I got another question for you guys. Do you think that Kupp is about to fall off the receiver quote-unquote cliff heading into his age 31 season, or do you still think that he has more left in the tank? Now, heading into the 2022 season, many people wondered how Tyreek Hill would perform as a member of the Dolphins, with him no longer having one of the best quarterbacks of all time in Patrick Mahomes throwing him the ball. Many people thought that he would take a steep drop-off statistically. Safe to say the haters couldn't have been more wrong, as he had one of the best seasons of his entire career. His Dolphins debut was a very strong one, pulling in 8 passes for 94 yards in the team's Week 1 20-7 win against the Patriots. This was just a preview for the following week though, as he went on to have his best game of the seasons when the Dolphins took on a tough Ravens team. But their secondary stood no chance against Hill's blazing speed. He torched them for an insane 11 catches for 190 yards and 2 touchdowns. His efforts took Miami over the top in this one and gave them a 42-38 shootout victory. While he didn't record a single game over 200 yards that season, he was very close multiple times, and he did have 7 games over 100 receiving yards or more. He'll finish the regular season with 119 receptions for 1,710 yards and 7 touchdowns. Shockingly, he didn't lead the league in any of these statistical categories. However, he did earn himself a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team and finished 4th in Offensive Player of the Year award voting behind Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Justin Jefferson. This isn't going to be the last time that you hear Tyreek on this list, by the way, with him being the only player in NFL history to ever have more than one season of 1,700 or more receiving yards heading into the 2024 season. Despite Tyreek Hill's elite year in 2022, he was outdueled by one receiver only, that player being Justin Jefferson. While he had an injury-riddled season this past year in 2023, his first 3 years in the league led to him quickly being deemed as the best wide receiver that the league had to offer. His 2022 campaign makes it hard to think otherwise. If he's able to stay healthy in 2024 and mesh well with rookie quarterback JJ McCarthy or Sam Darnold, whoever the starting quarterback may be, it shouldn't take long for Jefferson to retake his spot on the throne as the king of wide receivers. He kicked off his 2022 season with one of the best games of the year when the Vikings took on the Packers. On only 9 catches, Jefferson was able to rack up 184 yards and 2 touchdowns. He played a massive role in Minnesota's dominant win over their division division rival, taking the game by a final score of 23-7. While he didn't find the end zone in the Vikings Week 14 matchup against the Lions, it could still be argued that this was his strongest performance of the 2022 season. He torched the Lions for 223 yards on 11 catches. However, partially due to Jefferson failing to score in this game, the Vikings were defeated by a final score of 34-23. This was his only 200+ receiving game of that year. He also posted 10 games of 100 or more receiving yards. Jefferson ended the regular season with 128 receptions for 1,809 yards and 8 touchdowns, while averaging 106.4 receiving yards per game, leading the league in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving yards per game. This, of course, earned him a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, and he won the Offensive Player of the Year award and finished 5th in MVP voting. I'm definitely excited to see how JJ bounces back in 2024 because I just know he's going to be hungry and ready to dominate yet again. The 12th and newest member of the 1,700-yard club joined this list in 2023. That player was CeeDee Lamb. Similar to Jefferson, since joining the league, Lamb has proven himself as one of the most defining players of the future at the wide receiver position. He just recently had by far his best season yet in 2023. However, it didn't start off that way. Despite the Cowboys coming out of the gates hot with a dominant 40-0 win over the Giants in the opening game of the season, the same could not be said about their top wide receiver, with Lamb only pulling in all 4 of his targets for 77 yards and failing to find the end zone. A lot of game script problems in that one because they were winning by so much. They were just running the ball a lot. It's pretty understandable. However, it was games like his Week 17 performance against the Lions that got him over that 1,700-yard mark. In this contest, he pulled in 13 passes for a crazy 227 yards and a touchdown. Dallas needed every yard that they got out of their young star in this one, only winning by a final score of 20-19. While this was Lamb's only 200+ yard receiving performance of the season, he had 8 games over 100. He finished the season with 135 receptions for 1,749 yards and 12 touchdowns, leading the league in receptions. He also had the longest catch out of anybody in the NFL last year with 92 yards. This earned himself a spot in the Pro Bowl on the All-Pro First Team, and he finished 3rd in Offensive Player of the Year voting, behind only Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey. And as much as I despise the Cowboys as an Eagles fan, I gotta give them all the props in the world for how Lamb and Prescott played last season, in the regular season that is. Cowboys fans, you gotta win in the playoffs eventually, right? Maybe not. Rounding out this list is Tyreek Hill yet again, the only player in history that we talked about to have multiple seasons over 1,700 receiving yards. Interestingly, while he hasn't been with the Dolphins for too long, there's something in that Miami air because he's picked up 1,700+ yards each season that he's played for the team due to their style of big play offense. His best game of the season came in the season opener when Miami took on the Chargers. Hill couldn't have started off this season on a higher note, pulling in 11 catches for 215 yards and 2 touchdowns. This was his only 200+ receiving yard game. However, he did have 8 games over 100. He'll finish the regular season recording 119 receptions for 1,799 yards and 13 touchdowns, averaging 112.4 receiving yards per game, leading the league in receiving yards, receiving touchdowns, and receiving yards per game. Once again, Hill proved that even at the age of 29 years old, he was far too fast and shifty for any opposing defense to do much to stop him. To make these stats even more impressive, Hill even missed the game and still eclipsed that 1,700-yard mark. If he was able to suit up in all 17 games, there's definitely a chance that he could have even hit the 1,900-yard mark, knowing Tyreek, maybe even 2,000. Tyreek was named to the Pro Bowl, All-Pro First Team, and came in 2nd place in Offensive Player of the Year award voting, just behind Christian McCaffrey. It's going to be very interesting for us to see what Hill has in store for us next year because him and Tua have an elite connection and they keep getting better and better every year that they share the field. All right, rounding off this video, I want to know who you guys think is going to be the next player to join this list of 1,700+ yard receivers. If I had to take my best guess, I think it's either going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown or Jamar Chase if he and Joe Burrow can both stay healthy. That hasn't been the case the past few seasons. We'll see what they can do this year though. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, as always, drop a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you are new, for more videos like this one. Catch you in the next one.